welcome to Fixing Ignorance, a new podcast opening conversation on the big political, psychological, and philosophical questions of our time. My name is Jake Bonetta, and I will be the host of this podcast series. Each episode, I will be joined by a few guests, my friends and colleagues, talking about facts and our opinions on massive, serious, and thought-provoking issues in a more relaxed setting than a debate. Today, we will be talking about communism, specifically whether communism has indeed failed or not. However, before we get started on that, I am joined today by Noah Bodley Scott, George Tomkins, and Harry Long. Why don't you guys introduce yourselves and tell us a bit about you?
Hey, I'm Noah. I am or have been studying maths, music, and physics. I'm hoping to go on to study either popular music or something audio engineering based. Something I'm interested in the context of this. The topic of today's discussion is how art and media can be used to influence people's behaviour for the better.
Hi, my name is George Tomkins. I'm 18 and I've studied politics, music performance and music technology, and I'm going on to study contemporary and popular music, and I have a particular interest in political philosophy.
Hi, I'm Harry Long. I've studied at A-level RE, history, English literature and music. I'm going on to study Arabic at university, and I suppose I'm interested in the history of left-wing politics and where left-wing politics is going.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, guys. So, communism is a political ideology regarding governmental and social organisation, within which everyone is treated as equal. All property is owned by the collective community and is shared out according to the individual person's need. These ideas were first pioneered by German philosophers Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in their 1848 book The Communist Manifesto, which calls for a socialist uprising and revolution against the bourgeoisie, or ruling class. This is encompassed within the quote, "Workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chain," a famous quote which went on to be the motto of the Communist Soviet Union. However, communism has fallen to the political extremes in most parts of the world, following the collapse of the USSR in 1991, and many political and economic pundits have given many ideas surrounding why it has failed. It seems rather strange for an ideology that portrays itself as idyllic and perfectly fair and equal to all. So, guys, how and why do you think communism has in fact failed?
Well, I think Marx's sort of reactionary theory about the shortcomings of the capitalist system is something that has been built on by many communist states in the past. I think it is, however, the instating of his ideological views on capitalism's downfall that has led to many communist regimes having to enforce the ideals of Marx rather than them coming more naturally to a society. So Marx's theory is that workers or the proletariat will become class conscious, which means an entire social class will be aware of itself as a social class in the existence of other social classes around it, and they'll act in their own rational interest based upon this. And Marx believed that the proletariat class would rise up in a revolution to overthrow the bourgeois class, or the upper classes, who exploit the proletariat for their labour. This is often the phase which can lead to brutality against citizens or opponents to a communist regime. I think an example of this was in the Soviet Union when the Bolsheviks gained control of the Russian state and oversaw a period known as the Red Terror, which was a period of political repression and mass killings. The estimated loss of life is between 100,000 and 200,000. However, the number of executions has been widely debated, and some even claim there has been over 1 million. I think the failure for the proletariat to oversee a revolution that does not involve political repression of its citizens could be seen as a failure of Marx's original political theory, and that's why you could say that communism has failed.
Okay, yeah, no, you make a very good point there. Obviously, within communism, it is taught through the Communist Manifesto that people will become class conscious, as you said, but there needs to be an intermediary state before communism is fully enabled. And that state has often led to quite brutal things. Obviously, you mentioned the Red Terror, which occurred in Soviet Russia, but you also have things like famines and wars caused by it. For example, the 1933 famine in Ukraine, which saw many thousands of people die. Harry, did you have anything to say to the failures?
I think, yeah, it's fair to say, like George said, that generally speaking, the states and the regimes that are called communist, that called themselves communist, or at least aspired to a communist society in the long run, failed demonstrably, whether that's through the tyranny that resulted from them in the Soviet Union, as George said. That was there right from the start, really. Some people seem to suggest that it started going wrong when Stalin became dictator, but really the Bolshevik Revolution in October 1917, from the start, it was already authoritarian, and Lenin and Trotsky were involved in as much repression as Stalin was. Lenin set up the secret police, the Cheka, and Trotsky authorized the repression of the Kronstadt mutiny in 1921. Right from the start, it was authoritarian, it was oppressive, repressive, and the same is true of Cuba, Vietnam, and definitely China. In 2008, China had the most journalists imprisoned, Cuba the second most. So they're a failure in that sense, but they're also a failure in practical terms, because with some successes, with some small successes, generally what you get, as you pointed out, Jake, is famine, shortages, because the government is attempting to distribute food and goods to the population, but it usually isn't very good at doing that. The bureaucracy just fails miserably each time, and the attempts to collectivize farming, which Stalin did in the 30s and Mao started to do in the late 50s, also just ends in famine generally. So in moral terms and practical terms, yeah, all of those regimes failed. Some might say that they're not authentically communist, and perhaps there's something in that, but all of those regimes unequivocally failed, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there have been a lot of failures with communism, as you stated, and I think you're right to bring up Soviet Russia and its fall into oppression, but also bringing up China as well. Two very, very different communist societies that both have very oppressive regimes, or had very oppressive regimes, obviously, until the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Noah, did you have anything to say?
I largely agree, but I think that, as with a lot of things, it's important to consider what is being said and like why it's being said at all, because I think the statement that we're debating often comes with the assumption that attempts to enact communism have not worked, failed, therefore the ideology is not worth pursuing, which I think is a massive logical leap. To make that claim, you also have to compare these failures, as you have been describing, to the failures of the capitalist societies in which we're used to living, and the masses of famines and other disastrous occurrences that take place under its regime, I guess. Another thing that's got brought up a lot is this thing about freedom and oppression. And yes, of course, those societies were oppressive, and even a ideal communist society could be viewed as oppressive in some ways. But I think it's important to realize that the concept of freedom that we tend to think exists under capitalism isn't really there as much as people seem to think it is. And it is not a choice to go to work, for example, if the alternative is to starve. But to get back on the point, the failures of communism must be compared to the failures of capitalism in order to be useful. And it is not true to say without any qualification that something hasn't worked in the past, therefore it should never be attempted.
Okay, you bring up an interesting point, actually, comparing communism to capitalism, two very, very opposed ideologies, but both practice quite oppressive means to make money. For example, capitalism pretty much runs on a pyramid scheme of people. You've got the people at the top that are in charge of a lot of the wealth, and that is distributed down. Some would argue in the same way that Adam Smith would have liked in a trickle-down economy, but that in some circumstances can be seen as to not work. Whereas in communism, there's obviously some oppression when it comes to the centrally planned economy. Obviously, being allowed that freedom to have your property or have what you want or do what you want is quite restricted in that sense. Harry, did you have anything to say?
I would just add that, yeah, what Noah said is true. You can't say it will never work, but you can look at the attempts that have been made to achieve communism, and you can look at what went wrong. And I think it isn't too much of a stretch to say that virtually all attempts to bring about communism are susceptible to the kind of things that went wrong with those attempts, whether that is the growing tyranny, totalitarianism that you got, whether that is the corruption that infected the bureaucracy, or whether that's the inefficiency and the shortages. I think those are legitimate lessons to take from those examples, and maybe you could take from that. Well, if we are going to bring about communism, we can avoid those mistakes. But I think probably those are mistakes that are very likely to be made just because of the very nature of the aim.
I completely agreed with you almost right up to the end, but and I think it's very important to, or from my perspective, it's very important to frame this discussion in that way, because when you try something, it fails until it succeeds, which might seem very obvious, but people seem to forget it. That like, if you're trying to build a plane, you could look at all the millions of times it doesn't work and go, oh well, every attempt is going to be susceptible to those, which you can continue to say until such a point where it does work. From the perspective of someone who thinks that ideologically it is a fundamentally good idea, and or at least is fundamentally better than the prevailing ideology at the moment, i.e. capitalism, the failings of past attempts should be looked at as something to learn from and not used as a reason to ignore the ideas that underpin communism as an ideology, as some people. I don't think anyone talking today is trying to do that, but I think it's important to address, because a lot of people do that. They get as far in their thinking as, look at all these people who have died under communist regimes, and that's where their thinking stops, which I think is a massive mistake.
But it is a lot of people, so you can understand people's reluctance to want to run it again,
but again,
and perhaps want a more moderate and gradual style of reform.
Yeah, so I agree with you, Harry, there, but comparison is essential, because yes, lots of people did die, but lots of people die every day. And a lot of those deaths could be attributed to factors that capitalism enforces, and probably should be attributed in that way. I don't know how useful it would be to point to examples, but I could do even in the way the government is handling the coronavirus epidemic. And it seems like a strange coincidence that the first people to be sent back to work are not those who own businesses, and the people who own businesses are able to work from home for as long as they want, effectively, and the people being sent back to work, or some of them, are going to die because of it.
Certainly, but those problems of capitalism aren't necessarily just solvable through abolishing capitalism in its entirety. So I don't want to cut out George any longer. I'm sure he has lots of things to say.
I agree with Noah in some sense, in terms of that you have to make comparisons about the amount of deaths from a capitalist system to a communist system. I think one of the things in a capitalist system that I disagree with is the sort of, especially in the US, where they see healthcare as a private service rather than a human necessity. And I think that's where you have to look at some of the deaths from capitalism, comparing it to communism. Because there are many people in the US who, I'm sure, they don't go to the doctors because they can't afford to go to the doctors. They don't have health insurance, especially those with long-lasting illnesses, possibly like diabetes, if they can't afford insulin, or those who have cancer who can't afford their treatment. And so you have to look at some of the deaths that are brought about by the capitalist system as well when comparing it to the communist system.
Absolutely, yeah. But that problem is not usually fixed through a communist system. It's through a mixed economy where where it's recognised that the market isn't the solution to everything, which for me is a nice, moderate, and pragmatic way of approaching that kind of thing.
Yeah, I understand that sort of mixed economy ideal. And I think it is often quite difficult to compare capitalism and communism directly because I think a lot of the times we haven't had a fully formed communist state. Because in terms of Marxist theories, Marxist theory was that you'd have a state in order to redistribute wealth and the means of production to the workers, and then the state would wither away. And so it's quite difficult to try and compare capitalism and communism when we really don't have much of a comparison to what a fully formed communist society would look like.
Sure, but then I think a lot of people would probably say that it is impossible to get to that stage, and we've seen how the intermediate stages, the dictatorship of the proletariat, where that goes and how that can justify so many awful things.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to add in quickly, before we finish up this point specifically, there was some research done by the Institute for Public Policy Research, a think tank, in 2019 that suggested during the course of Tory austerity in the UK, so that's based on Conservative and Liberal Democrat governments since 2010, there have been around 131,000 preventable deaths due to austerity. So I think there is an important comparison to be made between the different capitalist and communist societies around the world and the deaths that they make, but a lot of them have different reasons. You could argue, say, from a social democrat perspective, that these austerity lives were fully avoidable and they were careless, but on the other end, you could argue that the communist deaths were very, very forced. They were very, very oppressive. So it's not just the number of lives taken. I think it also needs to be the malice behind it. Noah, one last point before we move on.
I completely disagree with the idea that intent matters particularly. But anyway, I was interested in what Harry says about talking about pragmatism in terms of healthcare. You said something like that has been solved through mixed economy. Yes, that is how it has been solved, but it hasn't been solved like that because that's the best way to deal with it. It's been solved like that because that's the easiest way to deal with it and the one that is most compatible with the status quo. I suppose you could argue that is an inherent benefit, is that compatibility with the status quo is kind of like part and parcel of anything you're trying to do.
I think I would, yeah.
To be completely frank, I'm reluctant to do that emotionally. I find that idea really quite sad. I like to think that we should be aiming for the best system and not just a system that can be brought about quickly and easily. Yeah, on healthcare specifically, the mixed economy model of it is obviously better than private healthcare, but it's still supported and held up by incredibly exploitative drug companies who are making it. So people are still making money off of healthcare in the UK. The idea that people could make money off of healthcare, and the thing is, I would extend this to food, housing, all of the basic necessities. People should not be making money off of any of that. There's no reason for them to do so. It's exploitative and inefficient and immoral. That's not an opinion I share. A lot of people share with me, but I don't know about you guys.
I would say that it's not perfect and there are improvements to be made, but we know it works.
Well,
and
it doesn't,
I'd
though.
rather stick within the parameters of that than take a leap into the unknown, especially if that unknown looks extremely difficult to achieve.
I really don't think it's fair to say that it works. It works for us, but there's hundreds of millions of people around the world whom it doesn't work for. And I think that's very important to remember.
So yeah, I think it is swings and roundabouts to talk about different ideologies and the ways that governments work around the world. I mean, there's this famous Winston Churchill quote saying that democracy is the worst form of government apart from all the others that have been tried. So obviously there are different opinions out there. There are different theories out there. So I think this pretty much segues us on to the flip side of the argument. So how and why do you think communism hasn't failed? Noah?
Well, I could point to examples of places in the world where ideas that are part of communism are being implemented very successfully and to the benefit of lots of people. I think that is useful, but almost to me, what is more important is purely theoretically and ideologically how it is just logically better than the current system that we have. I would argue that the ownership of things on which people are dependent is inherently exploitative, and profit in itself, which is kind of part of that and very closely linked to it, are inherently exploitative. I guess rent is a really easy example. What value is a landlord adding to society by making a profit off of buildings that they own? Obviously, money is required to maintain buildings, but the profit that landlords make almost always goes quite a lot further than that. So that's an example of both. That's an example of ownership and profit being exploitative. I would advocate for a system in which nobody owns anything of particular importance. I mean, nobody owns anything of importance to people's material conditions. I don't see any problem with ownership of... people should probably own their own clothes, but I struggle to see any good reason why it is useful for stuff to be owned that is necessary for other people to survive. Yeah, so that goes for all the basic necessities to live. I think people's material conditions should be met, and I think the resources exist in the world to do that. There's kind of this idea that there's not enough stuff to go around, but if you think about the massive concentration of resources that exists in modern society, I'm skeptical that is true.
Okay, I wanted to add a point that supports your argument for collective ownership in a way. If you look at Singapore as an example, their public housing system houses up to 80% of their population. It's based on a 99-year lease of flats between 1 and 5 bedrooms, and a massive majority of their population lives in governmentally owned and mandated properties. So there have been systems where public housing has worked, which shows that a common ownership sort of system can actually work in some sense. So I agree with you, Noah, there, I think. George, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think on Noah's point, in terms of if you only look into the past for examples of why something doesn't work, you'll never find examples of where it does, or innovations of the idea to make it work in the future. I think a lot of what Marx and Engels wrote, they wrote the Communist Manifesto in London, and they were German, and at that point, London, obviously England, it was sort of around the time of Industrial Revolution, and then it was heading into the 20th century where you had the First World War. And England and the UK at that time was a fairly rich nation compared to a lot of poorer nations in the East rather than in the West. And so I think a lot of communism and a lot of theory of communism was that in a society, through capitalism, the infrastructure that they saw in place in society was already there for the workers to seize their means of production and sustain themselves as a nation. And so I think possibly some of the failures of communism isn't just what happened, but also where it happened, because communism as an ideology has never really been implemented in a nation that has become wealthy through the existence of capitalism, and where you can then redistribute a large majority of wealth to the population.
I think you bring up a very poignant point, actually, George, talking about the successes and failures of communism. Obviously, pretty much all communist societies have been poorer societies that don't necessarily have the resources or the provisions to sustain their population in an equal way according to their need. So I think it is a very important point to make that Marx was writing in the context of London in the 1840s, a very, very split society with a lot of money, especially from one of the biggest colonial powers in the world. So talking about communism having failed because of their economic positions is actually quite unhelpful, because we wouldn't know how communism would come out in a wealthy society, per se. Noah, did you have anything to say?
Linking to this, I mean, if we're trading in historical examples, I think Vietnam is quite useful to consider when we're talking about like where communism has been tried and the situations that from which it arises. So I don't know how much people know about the history of the Vietnam War or various wars, but the long and the short of it is that their infrastructure was completely annihilated by the Americans and the French. But the point is that plenty of their cities were bombed to rubble, and poison was like literally sprayed on a lot of the farming land and undeveloped land, so that food physically couldn't be grown there for a very long time. I'm not actually sure whether that land has recovered yet, but they were in an absolutely dire situation, and they set about trying to implement communism, but have got to the point where they can't sustain themselves without interacting with other nations because of, as George was talking about, the conditions from which they started. And then what happens is that once they are dependent on other nations, they have to dilute their forms of governance and the ways of running their economy, because organizations like the World Trade Organization demand that they do so, otherwise they won't interact with them. And so they're basically forced into some sort of like democratic socialism with elements of market economy, because if they were going to implement the system that they wanted to, then nobody would trade with them. Yeah, so the WTO basically demanded that one of the things they demanded was that they open up businesses for private investment, both internally and notably externally, which allows economic imperialism to take place, basically, and you get powerful capitalist nations buying up their infrastructure. So yeah, I think we might have seen communism succeed in some places in the world if capitalist nations didn't feel so threatened by it and had traded with it on equitable terms so that people could do what they were trying to do.
I think it's an interesting idea about having a communist state that then interacts with other states around it, because the end goal of communism is to be stateless. And so I think in terms of poorer nations enacting communism and wealthier nations not being able to enact communism, some may say that poorer nations, it doesn't matter if it was tried in richer nations, it would fall to the same fate. I think I'd have to disagree with that, because I think in terms of if the state fell in a richer nation and you had the resources from a rich nation to redistribute to some of the poorer nations, I think you could see some successes in communism, because especially in this sort of globalized economy, the ones who had more wealth to begin with are accumulating more and more wealth because their market has expanded globally, and they've started to being able to exploit many other countries other than just the poorest in their society.
I think that could well be a very valid point about the location of these revolutions impacting on their success, because, like George said, Marx envisaged the proletariat and their revolution happening in the industrialized nations of Britain or Germany, and he certainly did not expect it to be happening in Russia, which was an extremely backward nation. It hadn't been industrialized, it was like semi-feudal, basically. About 80% of the population were peasants still. There wasn't an urban proletariat in the same way as in Germany and Britain. But Marx predicted that there would be a revolution in those countries in like a few decades, and he was wrong. It didn't happen. Lenin and the Bolsheviks were anxiously awaiting the revolution in Germany after their 1917 October Revolution. And there was a revolution in 1919 in Germany, but the means of production were not seized. And in the end, even though the SPD, they took power, it was the Weimar Republic which emerged, was by no means communist. It was vaguely socialist, but it was not communist. And Britain has had no such revolution. So Marx was wrong there. And I think that is a failure, not of an attempt at communism, but it's a failure in Marx's theory, because he imagined that it was inevitable that the proletariat would rise up. Britain was one of his examples, and that has not happened. And in fact, here the middle class has expanded a lot. There isn't actually much left of the traditional working class, because we're basically a post-industrialized country. So there is a working class, obviously, but it does not exist in the same way as it did back in 1848. And so I feel Marx, his ideas, they certainly need updating, because in the purest form, it didn't happen. So yeah, I think you could say that Marx's ideas have failed in the sense that his predictions just didn't come true, and for the time being at least, they're not going to.
Okay, if we have one last point from Noah, and then we'll move on to the last point of the day.
Well, directly leading on from the thing you said about, and they're not going to. I see an opportunity in the current political landscape in rich and some less rich Western countries. It seems pretty clear to me that people are very angry with the status quo as it exists, or at least there is anger there that comes out in political actions like the EU referendum in the UK, the election of Donald Trump in America, both of which I feel were brought about by the same kinds of right-wing populism, which in its purest form seems to me to basically involve directing anger at the other, and the other in this case is immigrants and foreigners. I think it's obviously quite significantly more nuanced than that. And I might say that kind of distillation of it is more true of America than it is of this country. But I see an opportunity for people's discontent to be redirected towards those who own. And I think the cause of a lot of their discontents actually genuinely do lie there. And they don't lie with the organizations and the people to which they're being directed at the moment.
Well, I think a lot of the sort of people you're talking about, they probably would see these kind of protests, this kind of discontent as coming from their dissatisfaction with the status quo and with globalization and how they don't feel they've benefited from it. And you could say globalization is just an extension of capitalism in the world we live in now. But they're not directing their anger at capitalism in general. Maybe you think that's just silly, and perhaps it is. But they're going in the wrong way though. Their discontent is going that it's not going in the direction that you'd like it to.
No, exactly. That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
And perhaps you could find a way of doing that. Although I suppose the Communist Party of Great Britain did advocate for Brexit, so I could be wrong.
Yeah, they're stupid for that. I think that, yes, the EU is a heavily capitalist organisation, but I think the Communist Party of Great Britain made the mistake of thinking that a change that you would like to see is good no matter what brought about the change, because the feelings that leaving the EU validated are not ones of class consciousness and socialist communist leanings. I think you got at exactly what I was trying to say, which is that there is discontent at the moment that I think should be harnessed by the left to make societal changes for the better in the direction of socialism and communism. I think in this part of the world, this isn't a good opportunity for a dramatic revolution. But if the left wing can get a bit better at telling their story, I guess, then I think there's an opportunity.
I agree completely. Yeah, I think exactly that.
Okay, I think we're going to have to move on to the next point quickly now. You made a good segue there, actually, Noah, by talking about the will of the people to actually go forth with some left-wing ideals, especially communism. Quickly before we move on, I guess it kind of links in, but if you look at France in the 2017 election, in the first round, the communist candidate, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, got nearly 20% of the vote. So there is a public mandate for communism in some parts of the Western world. So that brings me on to our third point of the day. And that is, what place does communism have in our modern day society, do you think? George?
I think communism could have a role in our modern day society, but it really depends how the political landscape shifts. As Noah was saying before, there's a lot of anger out there among predominantly working class people. And I think we saw that with the Brexit vote in the UK, where the majority of people who voted leave were from the working classes because they wanted to see change. They hadn't seen change. Nothing had really changed for them that would work. And so they were really willing to try anything to see if it would work for them. And unfortunately, I think they made a mistake in trusting the sort of right-wing politicians, because I think they're trying to uphold the status quo, and they're trying to uphold an upper class rather and exploiting the working class rather than trying to empower the working class to become class conscious and to act in their own self-interests. They're trying to harness the anger and direct it at something that has some loose connection to what they're angry at, and they're angry at cuts to the NHS, they're angry at cuts to councils, they're angry at cuts to schools, they're angry that a lot of the public services that they saw that have worked in the past are no longer working for them. And I think they made the mistake of trusting those who are trying to harness that anger to exploit them rather than those who are trying to harness it to empower them.
Okay, yeah, you make an interesting point there, George. Noah, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, also see opportunity in. I mean, it's perhaps cynical of me to say so, but I think, or I don't know if cynical is the right word. People might take issue with it anyway, but I think there's opportunity in the current coronavirus pandemic. Maybe the window of opportunity is over, but I was very hopeful that when people were not being allowed to work but were still being charged rent, they might refuse to do so. That's the sort of action that I would like to see, is people rent striking, people refusing to work if they feel that their safety isn't being insured. And also, I think that the epidemic that's currently happening might demonstrate to everyone that the most socialist elements of how our society is constructed are the ones that have become most essential in times of crises. And the most capitalist ones are the first to be moved aside a bit. I mean, I would argue not moved aside enough. But when something really bad happens, even Boris Johnson and his Tory government tend towards socialism and communism. And yeah.
I agree with you to an extent there, Noah. I think, obviously, it's very interesting to look at the predicament we're in at the moment with the COVID-19 pandemic and looking at the fact that we've got a quite right-wing government leading the most socialist government we have had since post-World War II era of Clement Attlee, putting in massive reforms to get our society through this in a socialist way. However, I think we have to be careful when we talk about protecting people through rent specifically. I want to move over to that point quickly, Noah. I think saying that people should refuse to pay rent is quite a dangerous precedent, because we have to remember that not all landlords are rich people with 20, 30 houses. They're a real estate magnate. They're not all Donald Trumps of this world. We have to remember that some of them they have inherited a second house and they are trying to make ends meet because they have a few jobs going, they have multiple kids. We have to make that distinction. We have to protect everyone in society. And I think that's what communism is about at the end of the day. So I'd be careful talking about that.
There's an extent to which I agree with you on that, Jake, but I don't know how far I agree with the idea that the person doing the exploiting has an effect on whether or not the exploitation should be allowed. Obviously, if I was like painting a propaganda poster or something, I would not put the struggling landlord who happens to have inherited and is struggling economically for other reasons as the person to look at and see the problems with. But rent is still exploitative. It does like I don't really think that the intent behind it changes how bad or good it is that much.
Okay, yeah. George, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I was just going to go back to Noah's point about people not going to work if they don't feel it's safe in this current COVID-19 pandemic. And I think we have seen a rise in the importance of unions in this pandemic, and especially the teachers' union in Britain at the moment has been very important, because obviously the government are trying to get primary schools back open during this pandemic as we're coming down the other side, but workers feel they will not be safe in their place of work if they return now. And we know that primary schools and small children are massive transmitters of disease. And we've seen a lot of councils refusing to follow government guidelines to open schools in order to try and protect their staff. And so I think we have seen a rise in the proletariat. It isn't a revolution, but it is steps towards defying state control of jobs and the workplace. And I think it's really refreshing to see the workers taking charge instead of having it enforced on them by the state.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you there, George. I think the COVID-19 pandemic precedent is not like one we have seen in our modern day society at all. And I think it shows as a great example as to why socialism can work, as to why capitalism may be flawed in certain ways. So I think it's definitely something that we need to look into once this has all happened, but also look into it now and see what the reaction of the workers are to, for example, teachers' lives being put on the line by being told to go back to school on the 1st of June. Harry?
Yeah, I think I agree that coronavirus has shown that capitalism is really rather fragile. The fact that you have Branson, people like him, like coming to the state asking for a bailout, it does show that it just that people who talk about, oh yeah, you got to have the free market and everyone out for themselves, when it comes to it, they don't really believe that because, as we can see, if it doesn't benefit them, they don't believe it. But we can hope for some change in the right direction after this, and I think we will get it. And the fact that the NHS, which is the most socialist of our institutions, is getting so much praise and airtime from everyone, absolutely everyone, including politicians. Maybe that will shift the overall political zeitgeist leftwards, and that would be good. But as for whether communism has a place in our modern society, I don't think it does. If it has any place, that will be in the future, and a long time in the future, because the conditions we're in at the moment, I just don't think we're anywhere close to being in a position to achieve anything like that. But I think we could see some very positive steps in the future, the near future. A lot of people been talking about universal basic income, and unfortunately no one seems to be pursuing that in government, but that would be a positive step forward, and that's an achievable way of increasing quality of life for people, and it's become quite mainstream in a way, UBI. So I'm hopeful that before too long that will be something that actually happens, and then we could get a Labour government in a few years. I think things will be moving in the right direction, a more social democratic Britain, and I think that's what modern Britain needs, and it's not communism at the moment.
Okay, one last point before we wrap up, Noah.
I just kind of wanted to say that I hope people don't underestimate the speed at which ideology can change. I was just thinking about how the hell America went from Barack Obama to Donald Trump. I mean, admittedly, I do not endorse Obama's politics, quite a lot of it, and he was complicit in some terrible things in the Middle East. But simply on a social level, I mean, everyone was saying during the presidential campaign that, oh, I mean, Trump can't win. Like, they're not going to regress that far in their social politics so quickly. Like, look at all the progress we've made. And then suddenly it happens. And I think the power of narrative and of getting in people's emotions, which is something that the left tends to shy away from, but I think the time has come to embrace it. Yeah, there's a lot of power in that, and opinion. If you play it right, you can tap into how people feel and their discontent, and take it in a good direction, and with quite some speed.
But at the moment, the left-wing populists, Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn, but I'm sure us four probably approve of quite a lot. That isn't the case for the wider electorate, and I can't really see that changing, because it's the young people. I mean, I can't see that changing in the short run anyway. Maybe in a few decades there'll be such appetite for all of that, but at the moment we live in a moderate kind of landscape, which isn't really big on massive radical change.
I don't think you can just look at the lack of success of left-wing candidates in the same way that you can look at the success of right-wing candidates, because they're just not using the same tactics. And that's what I'm saying. I'm advocating for a change in the behavior of our left-wing politicians.
Are they not?
I don't think so. Not quite to the same. I don't think Sanders or Clinton were barefacedly lying to the extent that Trump did, for example. And I'm not necessarily saying that left-wing candidates should lie, but I'm not saying that they should be quite so wedded to the truth as they seem to be at the moment. I would like people to come from a position of the things that we want to implement are better for our countries than the things that the opposition want to implement. And I think people should perhaps, I mean, I'm slightly scared of this idea myself, but I think there's something in it that we should get less squeamish about spin and about propaganda, basically, in order to make changes for the better. Because if we don't, I think there's a danger that a lot of changes for the worse are going to take place.
Okay, I think that'll pretty much wrap up our conversation today. We've gone into quite a lot of things based around communism, different political ideologies, and a lot of criticisms of capitalism. So I think that pretty much covers everything for today. So thank you all for coming along and getting involved.
Thank you very much, Jake.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so that wraps up today's episode of Fixing Ignorance. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation on communism and have taken at least one useful bit of information away from this. We will be recording and releasing 2 episodes a week during the COVID-19 pandemic at 3 p.m. on Mondays and Thursdays, and you can listen to them as they come out on Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, and all other major streaming platforms. I've been your host, Jake Bonetta. If you want, you can keep up to date with my political shenanigans and this podcast on Twitter @Jake Bonetta. See you next time, where we'll be looking at another big question with a new collection of voices. Thanks for listening.